We've lived through the most amazing era in the history of falconry. It's gone from a medieval sport to one where you have captive breeding, hybridization, telemetry, GPS, and now falconry is possible that has never been possible before. And let me just give a little background to this. A very great falconer, Blaine, said that most falconers could not explain what it was that intrigued them about birds of prey that then made them embrace falconry for the rest of their lives.
Yeah. Well, as a very young kid, I'd been given a book by Ernest Thompson Seton called Two Little Savages, about a couple of kids that went off and lived in the woods and whatever for a summer. And it really enthralled me, and the woods and the outdoors and all was really interesting. And then when I was 10, my folks rented a cabin up in the mountains, and my grandmother and I spent the whole summer up there. And there I was, surrounded by all this neat stuff in the wild and all that. But the cabin next to us had a man who was becoming a falconer. And I saw this guy, and I saw him with the birds and everything, and that was it. I mean, the bug bit, and I've been hooked ever since. But here is a man who, and he hasn't been heard of since, and I can understand because he was becoming a falconer with 2 marshhawks. So, but nonetheless, why that was the genesis of the whole thing. And
that's really interesting.
And I was age 10 at that point. Yeah,
I had exactly the same experience with Ronald Stevens. A friend of my mother's took me out to visit Ronald Stevens when I was 8 years old, and bam, that was it.
The hook is there. The hook is set, and then you don't get rid of that bug. That's all there is to it.
And then, of course, you went to university and studied under Aldo Leopold's son, I believe?
Yeah. I went to Berkeley. I had worked summers at the Natural History Museum at Stanford, but Stanford and Berkeley had an agreement. Stanford handled fish, and Berkeley handled the birds. And so, okay, fine. When my time came to go to college, I went to Berkeley. And was very fortunate to have a neat program there. And I studied wildlife management. I was going to be a wildlife manager, and so I joined the wildlife club and met Leopold, Darker Leopold, that is, Aldo's oldest son. And we struck up not just a professor-student relationship, but a friendly relationship, mainly because he found out that I had been banding birds, and among the eagles that I was banding, I'd found black-tailed deer as a prey. And he says, everybody knows it, and no one has ever documented it. And so, how about it? So, in my junior year, he gave me a senior thing on individual research, and I spent the whole of my junior year, the spring of my junior year, working on these eagles, writing down all this food that I was finding. And the next year, I did the same thing again in my senior year. I think 2 days before I graduated, I was still up in an eagle's nest. And so I went off to the service as I graduated from college. And I actually put the manuscript for that eagle study in the mail to him the day I got on an airplane to go to Korea. So,
wow. Is it actually in the archives now?
Oh yeah. Well, it was published. It was published in the Condor.
Right.
And I was very pleased with it. It worked out well. He was tickled, and it documented the golden eagle as a deer predator.
And had you actually trained a falcon by this point?
I had several birds, but in those days I was sort of a relic of the standard American approach in those days, where falconry was a whole lot more having than hawking. And I had never really mastered the conditioning of a bird. So I'd had several Cooper's hawks and whatever, which is, if ever there was a bird to run you out of falconry, that's it.
Absolutely.
There are some people I know that are made to deal with them, but my mentality doesn't work that way. Anyway, So I'd had some birds, but I didn't, and I had this passionate interest in the sport. And by the time I got to college, I had found a mentor in the area, Maynard Stevens, and he raised me up, and he raised me right, because he was a man who had done a lot. He was a wonderful hood maker, but he had a great interest in the background of the sport, the literature, the art. It really made a difference, because instead of just being a mentor who teaches you how to cut a pair of jesses, he gave you a big feel for the aesthetics of the sport.
And in those days, there were almost no books available.
Well, there were very, very few, and it was funny because I had another couple of friends there, and even in late in high school, we would jump in the Jeep and drive over the mountains to see this man, and land on him Friday night, and keep him up all night, talk, sleep on his floor in our sleeping bags, eat him out of house and home, picking this guy's brains forever. And so that was a real joy.
Weren't the old falconers wonderfully patient? I mean, I had the same experience growing up in Ireland and England with Ronald Stevens and Jack Mavrocordato and so many, and they just gave you their time and attention, and as you say, looked after one.
I mean, we ran this guy's life, his weekends, and he was very gentle, and he was very. Half the time, I'd ask him a question about this or that. He'd sort of get this faraway look in his eye, and he'd say, "My son," and then he would quote Timur Mirza out of the Persian treatise, and which intrigued me and gave me an interest in the Middle East. Then I worked for a summer in this fishing game, for the fishing game, and my superior, while I was gaining an education at Berkeley, this guy was shoveling pheasant manure at the state game farm. But by the time I was get out of Berkeley, he would have had 4 years of seniority in the game department with me. So I looked hard to what I might do as an alternative living without having to turn around and start up my education all over again. And ROTC was a piece of cake, and I took it, and I liked it. My father had been a career military person, and so I picked the military, and then fortunately within the military, I soon learned that I would not want to live going left, right, left all my life. But they had a program where we were going to go to war with Russia. You don't get off the boat in Russia, you have to go through a country. And so they had a program of training people to go one place or another and study those areas. So if that's where we got off the boat, we'd have someone who could advise the commanders on the local customs. So of course, Persia was one of the areas, and I grabbed that because of the Persian treatise and followed that the rest of my military career.
It's kind of mysterious that a book introduced you actually to your career in the military. A falconry book, one of the most important, 1908.
There's great wisdom in that book, and a lot of people poo-poo it, and they say, when he says that you feed a bird an antlion and a jerboa and the throat glands of sheep to make it molt, he knew what the hell he was talking about 100 years before we figured out the thyroid was a molt control. So.
Right. Yeah, I remember things out of that book. If you haven't got anything to feed your hawk, you actually slit your horse's throat and feed it on the blood coming.
How to cup a horse? Yes. Absolutely, or a camel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how long were you in the military altogether?
20 years, 1 month, and 12 days. I was eligible to retire at 20 years, but I would have retired the first of July, but the grouse season in Scotland didn't start till August, so I gave the Army an extra month.
And who did you visit in Scotland?
Well, I had earlier on, through Luff Meredith, I had met Geoffrey Pollard.
Right.
And we got along well, and so even while I was in the military, I've spent several periods of a week or 10 days with him early on, and as soon as I retired, I spent the next 2 grouse seasons with pollard, carrying the cadge, and so I had 2 full seasons. I mean, I've seen maybe 250 red grouse killed with peregrines.
Right.
And, by the time I was, just starting.
Yeah, it's a wonderful form of falconry. I did it for years.
It was spectacular. I hate to say I'm chauvinistic, but they need to see a sharp-tailed grouse to know what a grouse
Absolutely.
is like. But still, why? No, it was an education, and seeing it at that level, getting rolling in it, why, that was fine. In the meantime, through the military, from time to time, if my assignments would let me, I'd keep a bird, and I had a lot of fun with some goshawks, particularly stationed when I was in the Pentagon. And then later, my final assignment was in El Paso, Texas, which turned out to give me access to rabbit hawker's haven. I mean, it was unbelievable.
And you kind of got short wing hawking out of your system. I mean,
well, I did, and I came to, those early Cooper's hawks.
Right.
I had my last Cooper's hawk in 1950, swore I would never have another short wing.
Right.
And then I found out that goshawks were better than Cooper's hawks, and I got entered into passage goshawks, and had several fun birds.
And then when did you move over to Longwings?
Probably when I first retired, I worked out and went into the Middle East, went back to Iran as a civilian and did a peregrine migration study on my own to begin with. And then they saw what I was doing and asked me to come back the next year and do the same thing. And in the course of that, they let me catch a couple of passage birds off the beach, and I really started with Longwings there. I'd had a bird or 2 off Assateague and that sort of thing, but the eastern U.S. ain't fit for longwing hawking, so it was difficult. And I will say that most of my career, I was either in the Middle East or I was in the Pentagon dealing with things in the Middle East.
I've always been curious about the time that you spend with Jim Weaver and the lesser prairie chicken hawkers, because that sounded like it was a wonderful era.
We had an era and a half, and I was looking for a place to hawk. I had by that time was flying the birds that I had brought back from Iran. I'd been told that there were prairie chickens, and a falconer named Madison Haley invited me down to show me where they were, and I pulled the ultimate sin of a falconer and sort of moved in on his territory, which was, I have had a guilty conscience of that from that day on. But he told me that there were prairie chickens down there, and you should come down. And I went down, and there were prairie chickens everywhere, which is amazing because Weaver had been to the same place a couple of years earlier and hadn't seen a thing. And he knew prairie chicken. He knew what he was looking at. But I got down there, and there were prairie chickens all over. And the first thing I did was call Jim Weaver, and I said, "Weaver, get down here. This is the place." And Jim came down, and we spent that winter hawking. And from then on, every year, we would start about Thanksgiving and go until the end of the season.
Right, and then you used to migrate between Montana and...
Yeah, I had taken to going... when I first got out of the service and got settled down, I did a couple of years in living in that Volkswagen, doing the Persian thing with the migration study, and then lived in Mexico for a couple of years. But when I came back to the States, why I got onto this thing, and I wanted to hawk ducks, and teamed up with Ralph Rogers, and went to Montana in '76. And so I would go up to Montana until Thanksgiving, because Pep there in New Mexico, where we hawked chickens, was too hot to hawk in until after Thanksgiving. So I'd spend until Thanksgiving in Montana, go to the NAFA meet, wherever it was, and then go on from there to New Mexico and the prairie chickens.
And somewhere in all of this period, you must have had the inspiration that American falconry deserved its own archive?
Well, in the early 80s, I was going to say a matrimonial explosion, but I should.
You're not the only one who's had one of those.
More honestly, I should say I had another matrimonial explosion. And
You're a repeat exploder?
Unfortunately, yes. In the process, to buy her share of the house that we owned together, I sold my library and some of my equipment. And some of the things went, a gentleman named Walter Hill, who was an absolute Southern gentleman. He bought some of my things, but he said, "Kent, I'm old, and what am I gonna do with these things when I die?" And so I didn't know what to say, but there was no place. So it started me thinking, and what the heck am I gonna do? But the more I thought, I'd been interested in history, and like I said, my old mentor, Maynard Stevens in California, had generated this interest in history, and so I began to think, well, what would you do with it? And the obvious thing was we needed to collect it, and I was particularly touched at the time because American falconry really got underway in the 1930s. But by the early 1980s then, these guys who had been young college students and young college professors and such in the 30s were getting old. And their falconry things were being lost. And I can remember Bob Wiedemeyer, for example, when he passed away, I mean, his falconry library ended up for $1 or $2 a piece in a neighborhood garage sale. And we were losing the history of the sport. And I said, well, what the heck? If we just got started in the 30s, there can't be all that much history. Therefore, maybe we ought to start our own archives. And consequently, I scratched my head, and how do you do that? And very obviously, the place to go would be NAFA, which by that time was the North American National Falconry Club. And so maybe they will sponsor an archives, except that NAFA didn't have a place. I mean, NAFA's place really was the basement of the current secretary, and it shifted from secretary to secretary, so there was no facility for them. And the other problem was they had because they lobbied to get our regulations the way we needed them, as a lobbyist, as a lobbying organization, you're not eligible for tax deductibility. So NAFA was ineligible for a tax deduction. They had no place. What else do I do? Well, some years before, I had the good fortune to get associated with the Peregrine Fund, and by that time I had been on the board of directors of the fund for a number of years, and one of the jobs was picking a place to move, and we picked Boise and built the facility, which is now on top of the hill south of the Boise airport. So all of a sudden, the Peregrine Fund seemed to be a potential. And good enough, they have a place. We had this new facility on the top of the hill. That was lovely. Furthermore, they already had a tax deductible status in place. Aha! So all that paperwork is behind us. We can just use their tax deductibility. But the most important thing about the whole thing was the four guys that founded the Peregrine Fund, which is Tom Cade, Bob Berry, Jim Weaver, and Frank Bond. They were all hardcore falconers.
Absolutely.
And so when I complained about finding some place to help save the history of the sport, these guys were already deeply engaged in saving the bird with the Peregrine Fund and the captive breeding programs that it was doing. And so when I pitched them with the idea of working within their organization to save the history of falconry, fine. These guys, like I said, they were hardcore hawkers, and that's what made them enthusiastic supporters of the archives. They thought it was a good idea. They did make one point to me, and I could not agree more, but they said, if you're going to be a part of the Peregrine Fund, the archives would have to be self-sufficient financially. And this entire operation, from start to finish, has been financed virtually entirely by the falconers and falconry lovers, falconry clubs, falconry organizations.
I have to say that the four individuals who you mentioned
Surely.
are four of the finest men that I've ever met. I mean, just in terms of their dedication to the sport. When I came over here from England in the early 90s, that they all became good friends of mine, and what a wonderful group they were.
These guys simply would not accept the concept of extinction for the peregrine falcon.
Yes.
That's all there was to it. Whatever it was that they had to do, they were going to do it. And they did it. And it showed in the long haul when we had the Secretary of Interior come to the Peregrine Fund and make the announcement that the bird came off the endangered list. So, and their motivation wasn't just to get a bird for themselves to fly, because as Leopold described it, the wild would not be wild. Nature is not nature if something as totemic as the peregrine were no longer there. So
yes, there's a beautiful page in Sand Country Almanac where Leopold mentions that he thinks falconry is the perfect hobby.
Yeah.
He doesn't realize that a hobby is a hawk, but it's not really a serious hawk.
I'll say this, that quote gave us much mileage when we were trying to get the sport legalized, because the name Leopold in the conservation community is, among the top gurus.
Yes,
So,
absolutely. Of course, you start off trying to get this little archive off the ground, and then all of a sudden, it snowballs into something that now is undoubtedly the greatest falconry museum in the world.
It exemplifies the old bit about nothing succeeds like success.
Right.
Because in the beginning, we got, close to $100,000 worth of books the first year, mainly 2 libraries. But people understood, and although we only had 10 donors that first year, why people recognized the need for this, and they sent us their things, and they saw that we were doing exactly what we said we were going to. This is a repository run by falconers, for falconers, of falconry history. And it worked, and the more people gave to us, the more they saw us as a successful operation, and the more they supported us. We weren't unique at that point. We were unique in the world when we started it.
Right, and now other people have cottoned on, but a little late, because some of the most prized objects
Yeah, I hate to think it's, we started as the Archives of American Falconry, but as we were getting the product of what these guys in the 30s had collected, by the 80s, things were being dissipated, they were gone, and but you got to also remember that in the 30s, there were no American books. There was no American art. There was no American equipment. So a lot of the materials that we received from these old-time American falconers were in fact books, art, equipment, and such that had been gleaned from around the world, particularly from Britain, because we happened to share a common language, and that was the language the falconry books were in. And so we expanded rapidly in beyond just American falconry, and to the point where by 2004, we had enough international input that we changed the name to the Archives of Falconry, period. It's not as if we want to take all these other countries' stuff, but we would like examples of what they've got. We have strongly supported the idea of each country having its own archives. And I must say the British have sometimes looked at us, because we have, if everything British went out of this room, we would be
Yes.
tough straits.
I know one or two of the objects. And
Yeah,
they
right.
are.
I've got, for example, I've got a shotgun here that had belonged to old Colonel Thornton, and I had been at a British meeting, and this British friend walked up to me and he said, "You're the one with the Thornton urn," because we had, through Tony's good graces, located and obtained this wondrous urn from 18th century Britain. It was a great piece of unique British history. And I said yes, and I saw that this guy was going to be hostile, or I thought he was going to be hostile, so I was quickly conjuring up in my mind something to say about the Elgin marbles, which the British Museum has.
Yeah, the Greeks are still pissed off about that.
Exactly. And lo and behold, the guy said, "Well, if you got the urn, you ought to have this." And he handed this shotgun to me that was belonged to the original owner of the urn. So it was a great
That's
thing.
fabulous, because you get this kind of gravity when you have a collection of devoted to a particular area. It seems to suck in other things from elsewhere.
And we had the same thing happen. For example, in 2003, NAFA, the North American Falconers Association, wanted to have an international meeting. And so, among other things, to get international, they contacted an American falconer who had been practicing veterinary medicine in the Middle East for years, Ken Riddle, and they said, "Can you get us an Arab tent to put up at the NAFA meet to make it real international?" And so he talked to the sheikh and got a tent, and he sent it over to the NAFA meet, and they set it up in the lobby of the Hilton Hotel in Amarillo, Texas. And what the arrangement was that at the end of the meet, the tent would come to us. And so, okay, that's grand. And so we got it, and I hauled 800 pounds of goat hair in a wooden box back here, and thought, that's great, but it's in a box in the back room. So I went back to the sheikh, and I said, "Look, now that you've given us the tent, we need a box to put it in, a proper box." And I gave him some ideas and made a pitch, and he actually sent one of his people over to see, are these guys really on the up and up? And lo and behold, they saw this institution, they saw what we had done, they were impressed with it, and so lo and behold, he gave us a box to put the tent in. And it's 3,000 square feet behind me here in an Arab wing that's just stunning.
Well, it's one of the most eloquent forms of diplomacy.
Exactly.
Because without directly speaking about political issues, you actually demonstrate that there's this bond between falconers which transcends boundaries.
Absolutely. I mean, the falconers, no matter what language they all speak, in essence, the same language. You can get two falconers, one from Tajikistan and one from Argentina, and they can converse about falconry, even though neither one knows the other's language.
And they can tell almost instantly how good a falconer the other person is.
Yeah.
There's just that kind of instinctive thing,
right?
That this person is the real McCoy.
Yeah. This is the sixth iteration of facility for the fund. We started in a tiny closet in the Peregrine Fund's administration building, moved into a larger building, moved across the street into the Tropical Raptor barn, finally built our own wing in the admin building, and finally we got here. We just kept outgrowing ourselves, and so this thing built and built and built.
Now let's talk a little bit about the future of the archives and how you, as really the guiding light for so long, how would you like to see the archives develop?
Well, it is developing. You got to understand that for 20 years I ran this thing by myself, and what we were able to accomplish was commensurate with the amount of money we had and the amount of manpower we had to do it. And it was limited, and in those days my budget was about $18,000 a year. We went as far as we could, but it was limited. But with the success that we have enjoyed, other people have joined us in backing us in our expansion. And right now we are in the midst of a tremendous step upward that will help to spread the archives assets of into the falconry world where those assets need to belong. And
you're talking about digitization,
yeah,
and making these kind of films so that our history becomes available to a wider and wider audience.
Exactly. Yeah, we need to be able to expand the falconry community's access to what we've been able to put together here. And admittedly now, the basic concept when we found it was to collect and preserve for future the tangible evidence of the history of the sport. And consequently, why the preserve part means that nothing leaves the room. It's not a lending library by any means, but it is available to anybody who wants to come use it. And hopefully with this digitization, we'll be able to expand our outreach to better reach the falconry community.
Oh, boy. Kent, I want to thank you for a really wonderful experience. And I want to thank everybody else associated with the archives for enabling me to get together with you.